Alright, we're back with more NFL coverage, and in this one, I will be covering all of the action surrounding the divisional round weekend when it comes to developments and everything of the sort. In that, there are a lot of different hirings and firings to get into, along with a couple of releases and a follow-up to something I reported in one of my last recap videos when addressing some of the other happenings around the league off the field. But to get straight into it, the Giants would make a pretty interesting move by honestly getting what they believe to be, and one could argue that when he was fired, John Harbaugh quickly became the most in-demand coach on the market at this point of time. The second the Ravens let him go. It was already understood that there were a lot of teams trying to get their foot in the door when it came to interviewing the man. And of course, at a point in time, as I had reported on last, he was down to 4 teams. But the Giants were able to ultimately sweeten their offer up a little bit. And last week, initially reported by Adam Schefter, the Giants would sign him to a multi-year contract, 5 years, and at that time, the amount of money wasn't detailed just yet, but it looked like in that moment they had gotten their guy. And I've spent a lot of time, of course, when talking about what led up to his firing. There are definitely some things that you can hold against John Harbaugh in that situation, and he does not have it all put together when it comes to, some of his decision-making generally, clock management as well, considering the Giants also fired Brian Daboll at the halfway mark pretty much of the season, with him blowing so many fourth quarter leads himself, and the Giants struggling with that themselves this year. That could be a weird fit to have a guy in John Harbaugh who is infamous for blowing double-digit leads late in games himself. And that is ultimately what cost the Ravens their season. Even if you factor in other things, that was something that stuck out like a sore thumb. A blatant and just forthright blemish on their overall season. However, with John Harbaugh having that experience, having that Super Bowl championship on his resume, he's solidified at this point. And the Giants, they don't need a guy coming in there at this point after being through this constant cycle over the years. They don't need a guy who's going to, again, be the flashy hire, be the young hotshot that takes this team to unexpected heights in year one and then doesn't give them anything substantial for the rest of his tenure there. No, they need consistency in that entire organization, because it has been nothing but dysfunction over the past few years. Hell, you can even stretch it out to the last decade and some change. That is how chaotic it has been in New York. And Harbaugh, yes, he can be a pretty predictable coach at times. I think that's what some people may hold against him as well. There are moments where it's like, okay, we're just calling these predictable ass plays, or we're setting up these just unfavorable predicaments that are so easy to read on the part of another team. No true ingenuity whatsoever in that regard. We're just trying to spam a certain play call that does not work at all. And naturally, Harbaugh is going to have to learn his lesson with that. But aside from those negatives, he's not going to take you by surprise. He's not going to catch you off guard. And while one may be viewing that as a negative thing, at the same time, with just how bad this streak has been for the Giants, I'd much rather you get somebody consistent like John Harbaugh. Like, you know what to expect from him. And you know what a coach like him is going to expect out of those players. Demands nothing but excellence, year in, year out. And to have that standard, that culture in an organization that is still searching, honestly, outside of 2022, as much of an anomaly as that was, they are looking for something reminiscent to those early glory days they had as a franchise. They've been far removed from that. Now, there's a lot to look at it from this point, as we would find out that not everything was set in stone. But to kind of expand on the point of this being a good hire for the team at the time, as a lot of other people had been saying, and even as I had been thinking about myself, even though I wasn't alive for this point of time, this hire is Tom Coughlin-esque in a nutshell. From the very moment that move was made, everyone, and I mean everybody, instantly said, okay, this is pretty much like them getting Tom Coughlin back in 2004. And at that point, he was out for a year when it came to coaching entirely. But just consider this. Now, of course, Harbaugh spent a much longer time with the Ravens for the majority of his head coaching career. And at that point, the Ravens were an expansion team, or at least a team that was rebranded in 1996. But by that point in 2009, they'd been an established organization in the NFL. Still, nonetheless, you look at Tom Coughlin himself, and I mean, hell, he took the job with the Jags pretty much as their franchise got underway. And instantly, those guys were rolling throughout those first few seasons. They were in a position to take the league by storm. Consistent contenders, even getting this 99 season, where they went 14-2. Unexpectedly, if I do say so myself. Now, Coughlin, again, by the time he got to New York, was a little bit older. He was definitely a stricter coach, more traditional guy, but you understood that with that came a desire to maximize the talent that he had on his roster. And admittedly, when you look at some of the defining plays, especially when it comes to the 2 Super Bowl wins that Tom Coughlin got with the Giants, it's not like they involved players that were world-breaking. David Tyree, for example, that catch, as great as it was, it would make one think, if you didn't understand everything around football entirely, you would be led to believe that David Tyree was a consistent wide receiver for that team. In fact, he was far removed from that. I don't think he ever posted a reasonable receiving season, even as a guy who might have been a special teamer at this point in his career. And after that point, he never was able to reach those kinds of heights again. But I'll tell you what, again, under Tom Coughlin in that situation, he seemed to always find a way to get those players in those positions and be ready for whatever the moment asked them for. Think about the Mario Manningham catch in the 2011 playoffs and that Super Bowl that the Giants would also win at that time, with Tom Coughlin being a little older at this point. You're not expecting Mario Manningham to just up and make that play, and he himself would not have the most flattering NFL career out there. But when the moment called for him to make a play, he ended up getting it done. And that's the spirit you want to have from your leader at that point of time. Like, yes, having greater talent on your roster helps, always. And Harbaugh even said as such when it came, 2 different points in the press conference that I did end up watching, as things progressed. He alluded to that. Like, you want to be sure that those guys have the skills that they need in that moment, from development, from trust in the system, to ultimately rise up and be a core piece for this squad. And while it didn't end well in New York for Tom Coughlin, at that point one could understand it. He retired essentially, gave up on that job at 69 years old. But had done more than enough in his tenure in New York to warrant an early exit. 102-90 in that time. And yes, you could argue that at that point, like the Giants in hell with Eli Manning leading the way, we know what his overall record in his career was at that point. You could argue that they were mediocre, but they were still able to break through the mold every now and then and assert themselves as threats to their opponents in a Super Bowl setting. Crazy as that may sound. So the parallels between Coughlin and Harbaugh already exist. And while, again, the current Giants probably have a lot more talent to offer with some of the players that they have acquired over the past few years, clearly, between, again, having to deal with their own struggles in late game situations, being ravaged by injuries to some of their dynamic rookie players, second-year players like Cam Skattebo, like Jackson Dart for a time, and like Malik Neighbors, they had to get right to work immediately. That's exactly what it would take. And that is the message that John Harbaugh sent in the press conference. Now, even with all that being said, even with this being a prime fit, when you take into account the Coughlin parallel, and when you take into account what exactly the Giants would be looking for at this point, because I guess one more thing to understand here, when you take everything into account, is that looking at that time, from Tom Coughlin to now, it goes without saying that their head coaching has just been terrible. Like, I don't even need to go through record by record, but essentially, you look at this and you understand that outside of one season since 2015, and even that in and of itself was a bit of a miracle and turned out to be a one-off. Outside of one season under Ben McAdoo, his very first, the Giants have not finished with a 10-plus win season. Not even gotten that close to doing it, really. And the losing streak has just been terrible. In fact, some of the other coaches that would step in here, when you look at Ben McAdoo, you look at Steve Spagnuolo. Steve Spagnuolo as an interim for a brief period of time. And then also Pat Shurmur, Joe Judge, and Brian Daboll. Their tenures with this team were so fucking bad that they actually ended up with some of the worst records by overall winning percentage in franchise history in just a short period of time. And at that point, you could not do more damage to yourself in that situation by keeping these guys and allowing them to overstay their welcome. It felt like they were going to do the same thing with Brian Daboll for a little bit, and Daboll understood that. I mean, hell, you saw this man literally going into the tent during that Eagles game on Thursday night, trying his hardest to see if Jackson Dart was okay with the way he was playing at that point, because he knew his job was in jeopardy. And ultimately, he lost it anyways. So, moving forward and having a guy in which you can actually trust in John Harbaugh was important. You couldn't really say that for any of the other coaches in the cycle. And again, outside of Mike Tomlin, because he is, again, out of it. He's removed himself from that picture. He's not concerned with coaching anyone else at this point. Like, it felt like he, again, was going to be a Steeler for life, but I digress, different situation. In regards to Harbaugh, though, there was a little bit of a rift, because after that initial report, for a time, things were looking a bit confusing for a second. Because you get other reports talking about how the Giants were trying to rework some different details in said contract. And there was also a situation where John Harbaugh himself had a private meeting with one of the members of the Mara family, obviously, John Mara being the owner at this point, in an undisclosed location to hash over some more details potentially. So it's like at that point, we're hearing that it's off the table, and we don't really have any idea of what's going on. With the bits of information that you're hearing about, you have people mentioning that essentially John Harbaugh would be trying to work out, I guess, different pieces of language in said contract that essentially allow him to have, I guess, fuller control or greater control of how the team is run. And also, with some of the material as well, even John Harbaugh himself, though he didn't state this directly, he'd make several allusions to it, which I can get into in the press conference. Essentially making it to where the Giants, for the first time in their history, really, were going to put more emphasis on having a head coach owner connection, where they report directly to the man far and above as potentially the most important voice in the entire organization. Obviously, you're investing a ton of money into it. And the Giants, I guess previously, as explained by a microphone video I have been watching, I can put that in a card here. Essentially, for many, many years, they've been more focused on having the head coach report directly to the general manager. And it's been clear that over the past few years, that shit has not been effective, to say the least. Like, it's no disrespect to Joe Schoen, but at the same damn time, aside from a few solid draft picks over the past few years for Schoen, it's not been pretty. It's not been pretty at all. And clearly, they'd been taking steps back. So in this time, Harbaugh must have felt at that point that, okay, we need a full culture change. And that culture change might include phasing out Joe Schoen just a little bit in this entire thing, because we should honestly be able to question what he's doing. Now, Schoen still has his job. He's still going to be the general manager. He's still going to be able to make some moves and everything. But he is not going to be the primary voice of influence when it comes to roster construction. And they may be for the best. Truly. I mean, hell, like when you look at what, some of the stuff that Harbaugh was saying, you even felt that. Like, I couldn't tell you how many times that I heard this man, John Harbaugh, essentially say, "Right, Joe," on several occasions. Now, yeah, a two-word statement, you may not be able to make much from that. But at the same time, when you take into account how beforehand there was a separate instance where Joe Schoen was introducing John Harbaugh, and he was fucking hyperventilating it almost, in a way. Then you had Harbaugh just add in that little phrase on several different occasions. It's clear that at that point, because, after they worked all that out, he would officially sign on Saturday and be inked for a 5-year deal reportedly worth $20 million a year. So he's getting the big bucks. They are not fucking around. They're clearly invested in trying to get this thing on the right track and turn themselves into legitimate contenders. And Harbaugh clearly wants that too. And also, by doing that, that means that he wanted, at the time, a little more say in how things were going to be conducted around there. And that's not the worst possible thing. Like, again, comparing it to Coughlin, you look at some of the other coaches that they've run through over this time, and you look at the dysfunction combined with that. for all this time, you've seen nothing but just failure after failure after failure. On top of just all these different gaffes surrounding the on-the-field production. To where it's like, okay, do these people actually know what they're doing? Do we actually have an adult in the room? You could say that Mara was doing that. And even he himself was going through it. Now, of course, obviously, he's still dealing with health issues at this point when it comes to cancer, as I mentioned in a different recap. So obviously, you still want him to be recovering from that. But over the years, you've heard stuff coming from John Mara. And, I mean, a lot of it centered around him being discontent with what the hell was going on with the team. Even when it came to a different fan, like a couple of years ago or so to this point, having a blimp addressing him trying to make a move, well, it's like he, in a way, wanted to have some of that control being the hands-on owner for the team. However, the power rested a little more in Shane's hands, and at that time, Dable. And it's like, no, okay. Upon your wishes, Mara, we're going to do right by you, and we're going to give you a say in this. Even though he's a little older at this point, there's definitely, a lot of praise to that. Because if you allow him, being the owner of the team as it is, to start having a little bit more of an influence in how things are conducted, you've never tried it before. So how, at that point, with you hitting near rock bottom of the last few years, how would it hurt you at that point to give him a shot to at least be able to influence a few decisions every now and then on the team? Like that's not a bad thing at all. But yeah, Shane, I don't know. It's kind of crazy. It's like, even he, with some of the other quotes that I was hearing, it's like, you're going to have to cope harder, I guess. Because, again, you still will have your job, but it's clear that it is taking a step back year to year to year to year. And even though, again, some of the moves have made some sense at times, the fact that you overpaid for a man in Daniel Jones only for him to be released within about a season and a couple games of that contract, then have him go to Indianapolis and do what he did. You then proceed to not be willing to give Saquon his money, and he goes to Philadelphia and becomes an instant Super Bowl champion. And there are many other things, but you look at those kinds of moves right there, and they are red flags against Shane. So why, if we have a man who's done far greater, even if Shane wants to say that he's been in the NFL for 26 years, well, Harbaugh's at that point already accomplished far more and clearly has the mindset that you would need to be in control of a full team. Why would they not allow him to do that in a situation? And even with a different quote, you have one of the other members essentially say that if any other coach had been in this situation, they would probably not be willing to conform in that way. But Harbaugh, they wanted this. And Harbaugh repeatedly said throughout the press conference, this is the job that he wanted. So they were willing to, have that resume be on display. Hold that within a reasonable amount of merit. And say, you know what, we can take that on. We can allow you to do this. Because you have the pedigree to warrant that kind of demand. And with us, being at this current juncture in time, we essentially need you. And so we're willing to meet that demand. Also, too, when it comes to the Mara dynamic, I believe that at one point of time, Harbaugh essentially stated, during this press conference that the goal was to have John Mara be happy with the decisions that are being made here. And a lot of that would come with him, again, being involved, having some say in what is going on, and being able to influence some decisions when it comes to personnel, being able to influence some decisions when it comes to acquiring different talent out of the draft, out of free agency, whatever that may look like. The goal is to have John Mara be happy. And again, you got to respect that. Because as I've just stated, it's like you've heard of what has been going on with John Mara over the past few years. And again, all of them center around him just being pissed off consistently. Whether it be with some of the coaching, whether it be with the on-field production, whether it be with how, different funds are being utilized in terms of picking up talent that can be lackluster at times. You can't blame them for that. And now you have a chance to turn that around completely. You take that opportunity 9 times out of 10. So it's an interesting situation, and it's a lot of money. It's a lot of power, too. And we've seen, things like that. Now, of course, Harbaugh is still the head coach. But I will say, a parallel, and even then, it's not really comparable. But just think about what Bill Belichick was doing, for example, when it came to him being, an established Super Bowl champion for all that time and having full control of the team, being able to report to Robert Kraft himself. Because not only was he the head coach, he was also the general manager. And you can say what you want about his propensity and proficiency and success rate in both of those positions, especially as a general manager. But the point in that was Belichick, again, being the, forefront figure in a way, you could argue, he or Tom Brady, and that's been a debate over the course of some time, right? But with him being the face of that franchise for a while, and Brady as well, those guys were going to look directly to Robert Kraft when it came to making decisions for the benefit of the team. And it did not always work. It definitely tailed off as Belichick was making his way out of a job there. And that same kind of thing could happen, in a way, with John Harbaugh. But again, when you have constantly been in, even though power, that could become overwhelming in this situation, when you are a team who has consistently been towards the bottom of the NFL and cycling between drafting at different spots in the top 10 of the NFL draft over the past few years, constantly putting out an underwhelming and losing product, and you get this caliber of coach knocking at your front door, being willing to take on the job, you think at this moment that positives coming forth could outweigh any of that potential struggle now that you went through prior to acquiring your services. So from that standpoint, it's potentially a home run for the Giants if they handle this correctly. And if they don't, well, you're going to be owing him a hell of a lot of money. But regardless, again, with the way that it has been for them, it's a calculated risk. truly calculated. Something that they cannot say they have done since moving on from Tom Coughlin. Because for every one of these coaches, you're essentially just throwing darts at the wall, trying to see what sticks. And none of those guys did. None of those guys even lasted, aside from Dable, miraculously enough. None of those guys lasted for a substantial period of time for you to even build anything. Because you knew at that point that it was that bad. Each and every single one of these guys didn't even last more than 2 seasons. And Dable was on the fringe, essentially, for the past year and nearly a half that he was there. So, like, what good did that really do you since then? Not much. Harbaugh's got a chance to change the entire complexion of that team. And with the players as well, he also alluded to in the press conference, especially looking at Jackson Dart with some of the things that he said about him. He does respect the cast that they're building there. His main thing is, again, being disciplined on the defensive side of the football, which makes sense. Being tough, being physical, playing for the man next to you, and ultimately, as he said several times throughout the press conference, have an enthusiasm that shines through the day. I believe that's exactly what he said. There's something along those lines. And you felt that throughout the entire press conference. But he also kept on talking about players and personnel in general having love for the game of football. And that if they didn't, right, Joe? If they didn't, as he said, we can let those guys walk. That's the message. That's the message. You can have a lot of different drama going on. Fair enough. But if you don't love ball, if you don't have passion for the game, why are you here, he said. So it's definitely going to be intriguing. And this, again, it's not a guarantee, but at least they are willing to try, and I mean try, to take a step forward. That's where you have to start, at least, before being able to reach that next level. So, from that standpoint, and I'll cap it off there, to move on to some other news. The Packers would sign Matt LaFleur to a multi-year contract extension, and I guess it did catch some people by surprise with the way that you just randomly started hearing about his job being in potential jeopardy after the loss. Like, that's just such recency bias. It truly is. You know, you're quick to make that judgment, and in the moment, maybe you're not all wrong. Like, that collapse is just so terrible on so many fronts that is probably the first thing you'd rush off to say. But at the same time, LaFleur has been nothing but consistent for this team. And to move on from him, you would probably be doing yourself a disservice. As this quote from Sports Illustrated states, essentially, down later on, they mention that, quote, in 7 seasons, LaFleur's regular season record is 76-40-1. That is a .654 winning percentage in NFL history. 207 coaches have led their team for at least 50 games. From that group, LaFleur ranks 16th in NFL history in winning percentage. 9 of the coaches in front of him are Hall of Famers, including Vince Lombardi, who was 3rd. And according to the Elias Sports Bureau via the Dope Sheet, LaFleur ranks 2nd in NFL history in wins among coaches in their first 7 seasons, trailing only former 49ers coach George Seifert with 86 in 1889 through 1995. End quote. So you take all those different numbers into account. 76-40-1, the second most wins behind George Seifert for a head coach in their first 7 seasons, and he's still a fairly young guy, too, to keep that in mind. Why would you want to let that go? As I've already said, when you look at the firing of Sean McDermott, you don't find those consistent kinds of coaches that much in every cycle. You just don't. Like, yes, having, some of these firings go down is a surprise. But if you are a team that has constantly established yourself as a playoff contender, and I get that you want to take the next step forward, I get that you want to reach a Super Bowl, which Matt LaFleur has never done despite making 2 NFC championship games to this point. As I said, you have to be willing sometimes to take whatever you can get when it comes to, that level of consistency. It just isn't always guaranteed. Like that's why you see, some of these different teams, some emerge as just unexpected dark horse caliber types throughout a regular season. And we've seen some of that this year. Meanwhile, other teams that were expected at times to be much greater had a very crappy season in general. Like, nothing's guaranteed in the NFL. So if you have a guy who's somewhat reliable, like, you do everything in your power to keep him. Again, out of most of the other names here, with nothing much really happening on that front, you can't guarantee that you'd be able to let LaFleur go, get a new coach in that system, and allow him to have similar success with a roster that has been through so much. Like, you got to understand, as this quote says right here, to just put everything in perspective, he's done it with one young team after another. The Packers entered each of the last 3 seasons as the youngest team in the NFL. All 3 teams reached the playoffs. Impressively, LaFleur has won 2 games with a veteran quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, and a first-time starter, Jordan Love. He's won games with a Hall of Fame caliber receiver in Davante Adams and a receiver core without a number 1. The Packers were 5-1-1 after 7 games until they were systematically dismantled by one key injury after another. Injuries aren't an excuse, but they are an explanation, which was perhaps a big reason for new team president Ed Policy's decision to stand by LaFleur. End quote. So you just gotta, put it into that perspective. Not only has LaFleur been winning, but he's won in pretty much every single way you could ask for a coach to do so, even in situations where you wouldn't expect one to succeed at all. How can you expect coaches to consistently overcome a litany of injuries, and not just injuries to, scrub players? This is Green Bay Packers' version of a Sports Illustrated website, essentially. And from that standpoint, they mention you have Tucker Kraft down, Micah Parsons down, Elgton Jenkins down, Devontae Wyatt, and Zach Tom down. All of those guys are valuable pieces to this team. And yes, I definitely shat on them with some of the games that they did lose this season. Don't get it fucked up. I will say that. They had no business dropping games to teams like the Browns or the Panthers. I will admit that. But they were still able to make themselves a playoff run. And, if you manage that second half any better, the Packers had a great shot at advancing to the divisional round, in spite of all those injuries. That entire time where Aaron Rodgers was still starting and you had Jordan Love as a backup, as controversial as that time was, they still found a way to consistently contend on repeat. And damning of all, we've seen this wide receiver by committee system in a way for the Packers over the past few seasons. A lot of young guys, and you could argue that specific position on the field, along with, I guess you could say, linebacker and Quay Walker and those guys, that makes up a good, aggregate of the average of their age, making them one of the youngest teams at that point. And they've still done nothing but make the playoffs more often than not. You want more, again, you desire more as a Packers fan in this scenario, but when you're constantly working with a cast that just rotates on a season-to-season basis and you're still scheming up method after method to get them in their best possible positions to win ball games and at a high level and at a consistent enough level to solidify yourself as a playoff team year in and year out. That has to be respected. You can't discount that and then decide, oh, okay, we're not going to give him another chance with our team at all. It's ridiculous. As this Sports Illustrated article also states, you had a lot of the players, including Josh Jacobs with a couple of quotes here, place a lot, and I mean a lot, of emphasis on what he meant as a coach to their, overall experience as players. Micah Parsons as well, also, with this entire quote right here, puts it all into perspective. Quote, via him, the change is the players. Us players are the ones that's playing the game. The change is the players. I challenge the guys today. Do more than what your jobs require. If you're in shape, run more, do more. If we gotta play 80 snaps, we play 80 fucking snaps. We shouldn't be tired doing that. We gotta strain. Look how many plays we lost just because we got outstrained. That's things that can't happen. End quote. And it makes it to where that aspect of things, that general effort and that attention to detail in execution is something that he himself is indicting the players with, not Matt LaFleur. And whether or not that did influence the Packers president at this point, to hinge the focus there does wonders for LaFleur, no matter how you slice it. And ultimately, yeah, you could say that as well. Because, as we said, with that comeback, as much as you want to blame it on LaFleur for not managing the game well, there's only so much a coach can do in that situation. And you would have a number of different people overall responsible in that situation in terms of blame. It doesn't just fall on him specifically when you have anything like that go down. So, in LaFleur's case, and he's had a lot of early success with the team. And the Packers aren't done in that regard, as they also, as this article would state initially, and like the title, they would say that Brian Gutekunst could be up next for a contract extension. And he is their general manager. So this could get really interesting for them. Doesn't come without its potential losses and drawbacks. Because even with LaFleur saying that doesn't mean he's entitled to keep his entire staff. As this quote says here from the Sports Illustrated article, quote, beyond the injuries, LaFleur is probably going to have to make significant changes to his coaching staff with the expectation that defensive coordinator Jeff Hafley is poised to fill one of the 8 head coaching vacancies. LaFleur might also be eyeing new coordinators on offense and special teams and some new position coaches. End quote. When you have a unit that performs that well, for the most part, especially when those guys are healthy, it's going to be hard to retain a coordinator for the longest period of time. Because when they reach that peak, teams are going to want to emulate that. Teams are going to want to have that immediate exposure to the coordinator themselves. And so a number of teams have, in fact, pursued Jeff Hafley to this point, with them to transfer over, I guess, in that way, you would have the Dolphins hire Jeff Hafley as a head coach earlier in the week. And we do understand from the Dolphins' perspective how it went for them the last time they hired a defensive coordinator, because that was Brian Flores. And, yeah. You know, from that perspective, it could look bad. However, with the John Eric Sullivan connection, seeing as they're both from Green Bay, honestly makes this a perfect fit. If John Eric Sullivan is handling that work as a GM, you best believe that with having Jeff Hafley there overseeing the entire team, and especially when it comes to the defensive side of the ball, you can ensure that he's going to do everything in his power to make sure to acquire talent that fits Jeff Hafley's scheme to perfection. Of course, it was mentioned as I was going through the Trevon Diggs thing that he consistently ran zone coverage throughout the entire year. And honestly, with the weak personnel on that side of the ball when it comes to corners, the goal there would be to acquire much better talent in free agency and throughout the draft that fits specifically to Hafley's scheme and any other coordinator, offensive or defensive, that might end up on that team with him. But again, Hafley, when he was doing his work as a DC with the Packers, was truly legit. And, they need a lot of work, generally speaking. That's why the Dolphins finished where they did at this point. And they wouldn't have been looking for a new head coach in this scenario if they'd done even remotely optimal at that time. However, there's work to be done. And you already have some insight from John Eric Sullivan as well. Like, I believe I came across something, and essentially he was mentioning, some core players on the team and, talking about some of their skill sets, what they meant to whatever side of the ball, offensively, defensively, and how he'd like to continue to have them develop, harness that talent, and get players that can pair up really nicely alongside them. People wanted to make a lot out of him not mentioning Tua Tagovailoa in that specific sentiment. And maybe there's something to that, but at the same time, did Tagovailoa do himself any favors by saying that it would be dope for him to play somewhere else, essentially? Like, when you say that, you send a bad message. But of course, with Tagovailoa, that has not been uncommon for him, especially this season. So how, if you don't expect that for yourself, can you have John Eric Sullivan view you as a key asset on this football team in the years to come? It'd just be very difficult to expect that out of him when you already shut down an idea of moving forward with the team at large. I'm not too sure about that. Hafley deserves the job. And even with the work that has to be put into it, he now gets a chance to lead this team alongside another former Packer and collaborate in an effective way to help this Dolphins team make some noise in the AFC East. I can't really, say how they'll do in year one, and it'd be really interesting to see how they approach different things when it comes to the draft, when it comes to free agency, and when it comes to the development process. Even with some of these positions being that terrible, there are still guys to, retain and intently focus on. And it'd be interesting to see which ones Hafley and John Eric Sullivan are keyed in on saying, hey, that right there, this guy, he's definitely a great fit for our team. The Falcons would also make a tremendously good move as they would hire Kevin Stefanski earlier in the week as well. And I will toot my own horn because I called that shit. I did. I said, hey, if Stefanski is on the board, the Falcons could be a really good fit for him because Stefanski at that point, he's a good coach and you are actually giving him a good roster to work with in Atlanta for the most part. The main thing for them is figuring out how they're going to go about their offensive line. Jake Matthews, as good as he is, he's getting older. And aside from, a couple other guys on that line, you need reinforcements. You genuinely need reinforcements on that side of the ball. And if you don't get them, that could be an issue. In most other places, though, with the way that they have been able to ascend as a, at least some of their players have been able to ascend as talent. Like, could you imagine what the hell John Robinson is going to do in that offense? Could you imagine what it feels like for Stefanski to actually have a true number one receiver to work with in Drake London? Filled out with other talent all across the board when looking at Darnell Mooney, when looking at Kyle Pitts Sr. and others. It's a far cry from what the hell he was working with in Cleveland. A far cry. So it is damn near the ideal match between team and coach in this situation. And yes, Stefanski, again, owns some culpability for what went down in Cleveland. But again, he was being scapegoated at that time, in my opinion. And I did not really appreciate that, to say the least. There was no reason to go about it that way. Because that shit that the Haslams pulled off. Haslams and the general manager and Andrew Berry invested that money into Deshaun Watson to make him an offer that he couldn't refuse. Like, come on, man. You gotta be fucking kidding me right now. That is not on him. Now, granted, you're walking into a little bit of the same thing in this situation at potentially the most important position when it comes to the quarterback. Because already Stefanski is going to be working to get as much as he can out of this roster and acquire the right talent in different spots to make things work. Most of it's set when you look at your skill position guys, and especially when you look at some of the spots on defense. Yes, you could afford another linebacker maybe. I don't know if J.D. Bertrand should be getting playing time. And you could probably afford another, or try to get another rusher at some point, because Leonard Floyd is getting up there in age. He's probably going to be on his way out of the league soon. But aside from those things, maybe a few other positions that I might not be as intently focused on. Yeah, you could probably say secondary corner probably. Because, again, the offer, I just don't know. I don't know about them. But I digress, right? Most positions on that defense, with some of the young guys that they were able to get just out of the last draft alone, oh, they're setting themselves up nicely there for the future in that regard. It is looking bright, especially for James Pierce Jr., especially for Xavier Watts. Like, they are dogs, man. And Billy Bowman Jr. as well was doing okay, but again, injured throughout most of the rest of the season. That's something that you can't control. When he was playing, he was doing very well, though. So they've got a lot to work with there. But the quarterback position is already at a crossroads before Stefanski even steps foot in there. Now it's just going to be amplified, and he's going to be in a similar scenario at that position that he was in Cleveland. The thing is, Penix Jr. and Cousins are far more experienced at this point. Penix Jr. would be in, at this time, his third season. And Kirk Cousins is obviously an established veteran as long as he's with the team. There's no question about that. But you're going to have to figure out who exactly you'd want to start in this scenario. And again, he didn't create this problem. Fontenot is promptly out of the door for making that stupid-ass decision on draft day in 2024 to pick up Penix Jr. at that spot, knowing you had Kirk Cousins already. Overpaid as he might have been at the time, and still is, given the fact that he's in constant flux. But I digress. Like, you have to make a decision on that. And honestly, no matter what you do, it's not like you can win. You know, you start Kirk Cousins, you're hindering Michael Penix Jr.'s development as he gets already, with him being one of the older rookies at that time, already on the near edge of his prime in terms of general age, right? Knowing that he has not put it all together in his first couple of seasons of play as a quarterback, this year could be a pivotal one in his development. And from that respect, he'd need to play. But at the same time, if you start Penix Jr. and don't give Kirk Cousins that starting label and all, then he's in a spot where, once again, he's riding the bench, eating up their cap, because it's a mostly guaranteed deal, I believe, if not fully. So you owe him most, if not every single dime. And he'd be sitting on the bench for the great portion of yet another season, as he's already taking steps back physically in terms of general regression with age. It's just not a good outcome no matter what you do in that situation. And so Stefanski, from that standpoint, will be tested. His ability to, dial plays up is going to be put to the test. And likewise, in a way, for, a couple of their other moves here, because the Falcons would not just stop at that point. They would also hire Bill Callahan as offensive line coach. And you would also have Tommy Rees, formerly of the Browns, follow him over to Atlanta as an offensive coordinator there. Now again, as we know, as I just stated, the offense was very lackluster for Cleveland. And Rees, again, he and Stefanski, at different points in the season, both had involvement in how plays were being called. So Rees is definitely in a similar spot where, okay, the offense itself was atrocious and you deserve blame for that, with some of the just lack of creativity in the offense. I mean, granted, they tried, but it wasn't effective at all. No matter who they started. Dylan Gabriel could not give them the pop that they needed on offense. And you also had Shedeur Sanders just be volatile with the ball in his hands, it felt like. There's a reason why he finished with more interceptions than touchdown passes on the season, after all. So having those conflicting dynamics with equally underwhelming results is tough to deal with. But Rees as well is going to have even more of a purpose to work alongside these players and put them in their best possible positions on the field. Like, that is a massive talent upgrade all across the board when it comes to skill position players for the Falcons compared to skill position players for the Browns. And it's not hard. I was coming across something mentioning that the Browns had essentially ranked dead last in terms of quality when it came to, their receiving core. That's how bad that was. I can assure you that the Falcons probably have got one of the better units in the NFL. So if anything, because they, had an inconsistent season, I would say, offensively. And, man, having those guys in there, multiple offensive minds, paired up with a talent, that just completely can overpower some of the other teams in the NFL. Namely in John Robinson, but again, also in other guys that I've mentioned to this point. That makes your job way easier. So it is going to be fun to see what the Falcons do from there. The Lions would, I ain't gonna lie, I don't know about this one. They would hire Drew Petzing earlier in the week. Yeah, that Drew Petzing. I don't know if that was the smartest decision in the world for them. I'm not going to lie. Like, you look at their offense this season when it comes down to the Cardinals, 23rd in points and 19th in yards. And with some of the stuff you kept hearing about Drew Petzing the whole time, was that a lot of his plays were slow developing in nature. And especially with the way that line got demolished throughout the season, you saw it once Kyler Murray went down with said injury as well. You did not have all the time in the world consistently to keep on getting away with that. You did have some games where Jacoby Brissett was able to line up the scoreboard and they still got blown out by 20 points in those situations. Look, is Petzing a bad offensive coordinator? Probably not. And, you even had Amon-Ra St. Brown come out in defense of him for people that were criticizing the hire. In the moment, I was just thinking that, with some of the other offensive coordinators out on the market at that point of time, before they hired him, namely Mike McDaniel, foreshadowing, I thought they could get a little better at that position, personally. And they would settle. It's kind of like, I don't know. At that point, you probably wanted to alleviate the pressure off of Dan Campbell. And I think that's fair. Like, John Morton was coming off of this as a passing game coordinator. And you had the overall experience from Drew Petzing here. But just to favor that, it's kind of weird. I mean, just last season, though, even with them being a mediocre team, with Petzing still being there, they were 12th in points and 11th in yards. So there had to be some varying reason for the drop-off, namely Kyler Murray and him being an explosive quarterback out of the backfield is going to benefit that in ways, but I'm sure that there was a lot more to it. When it comes down to this fit for the Lions, on the other hand, I could see how slow developing plays would work for this team. You have a great offensive line to work with, first and foremost. So when you have defenses being kept on their toes with how they operate it, you're, in theory, going to keep Jared Goff protected and give him a clean pocket to work with and allow him to release these passes. That's how it's worked all the time with this Lions team. And they've got an abundance of skill position players for Petzing to dial up plays to at will. That's one thing that can help them. Like that core wide receivers, running backs, tight ends when Laporta gets back. They are so good as a collective that it is going to be hard for any defense to game plan for all of those guys when they're healthy. And so to have that kind of play calling go down, it works. You give those versatile wide receivers enough space to do whatever they have to do on the outside or even work inside with some in-breaking routes with some slants to get some action going. You can have Sam Laporta be the versatile weapon he is out of the backfield as a tight end. You can have Jahmyr Gibbs continue to do dynamic work. Generally, is a scrimmage player all over the place. And David Montgomery, of course, is going to be your power guy. So from that standpoint, it's like, yeah, you have got a lot to work with if you're Drew Petzing. And it's just about building that kind of scheme around them to truly make things work. Because even with me saying all that stuff in theory, clearly, when it came to some injuries, and yes, some of that came on the offensive line, but clearly they regressed this season massively. And a lot of that could be chalked up to John Morton having such a slow start with the team. As I stated, the offense overall improved under Dan Campbell when he took over play calling duties at that point. But it wasn't perfect. In fact, it was rather sloppy. And the goal, obviously, is to avoid anything like that from happening again. So I'd expect Petzing in this situation, he's probably going to have to change up his scheme a little bit. If it's favoring just slow developing plays and some predictable run calls, no. The Lions, no matter what they've had happen, they run a lot of elaborate calls. Slow developing, yes, sometimes, but they are truly thriving when they're getting in their creative bag. And understandably, again, they are feeling the effects of not having a truly creative mind in Ben Johnson handling those play calling duties. But Morton was far removed from that, even with some of the trick plays they were able to dial up at times on the fly. Far removed from that. And Petzing, if he wants to find his true success with this team, that is what it is going to take. It's going to be predicated on what he does outside of the box to make this team even more dangerous as an offense. If he can't figure that out, this is more than likely going to fail. But we will see what happens. The Chiefs would bring back an old friend of theirs. Per multiple sources, as this quote from ESPN states, the Chiefs agreed to a multi-year contract with Eric Bienemy to be their new offensive coordinator, the same role he had with the team from 2018 to 2022, a league source told ESPN on Wednesday. And, even with some of the numbers here that I can, reference from these articles, it goes without saying. The second I saw this, I said, the wrath of the Matt Nagy bullshit is over, and there is a chance for the Chiefs to turn back the clock a little bit. Get going again with what they were doing as an offense that took the league by storm for that 5-year period between 2018 and 2022. Like, you look at it, you look at the splits, it's night and day. Where, the Chiefs have continued this dynasty of theirs since then, but clearly it has been a struggle. They got taken to the brink in that Super Bowl against the Eagles in 58. And then in 60, we understand what happened in 60. By that point, the entire thing, the entire operation just folded. Matt Nagy's offense was so predictable. You want to talk about a lack of creativity. You want to talk about a lack of ability to stretch the ball down the field. You want to talk about a lack of ability to even initiate the run game. That was Matt Nagy's offense for at least the past 3 seasons. When he retook it over after Eric Bienemy left, and even that, was under, I guess, a self-inflicted situation, you could argue. Fair enough. But he knows, and everybody around the league knew, that the second that Bienemy left this team, onward, they were never the same offensively. I mean, you just look at the Chiefs' offense over the past 3 years, and it paints a sad picture, especially when you juxtapose that with the way that they started out this thing. And yes, they won 2 Super Bowls from 2022 onward. But it's like, man, everything else after that has been a struggle. They've taken a step back every single season. They were 15th in points in both 2023 and 2024 before falling off of a cliff completely last year, with them being 21st in points and 20th in yards. I mean, geez, bro. A far cry from what the hell they were doing from 2018 onward. Because as this quote overall from ESPN would state, quote, in his previous 5 seasons as the Chiefs coordinator, Bienemy helped the unit finish no lower than 6th in points per game. In 2022, Bienemy played a major role in Mahomes' league MVP and the Chiefs winning the Super Bowl. One of the biggest objectives for Bienemy this time will be improving the development of the Chiefs' skill position players, such as receivers Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy. Often this season, the Chiefs struggled to find answers when Mahomes faced man-to-man coverage. The star QB tried to do his best when his receivers couldn't get open by scrambling to extend the play in hopes of creating a highlight. But he completed only 41% of his passes when under duress, the lowest such percentage in his career. In addition, the production from running backs Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt was among the NFL's worst. Pacheco didn't have a single rush of 20 more yards, and Hunt had just one. This season, Bienemy made a significant impact on Chicago's running attack, which was second best in the league behind DeAndre Swift and Kyle Monangai. End quote. So let's just break that all down. And that first chunk of that quote says it all for you. No lower than 6 in points per game. And truly a threat all over the place. Now, again, you consider that, and you also consider a potential development amongst these younger receivers on this team. Those years coincided with Tyreek Hill's presence in that offense as an ascending star and, quite frankly, the X factor for that team. Yes, Travis Kelce in those situations where Tyreek Hill was potentially getting double and triple teamed by a convergence of defenders over top, you had Kelce be the consistent cleanup man underneath. And he's remained that way when he's been at the peak of his powers over the past few seasons. But as, he continues to get up there in age, it's becoming less and less reliable, and that's been clear. So Matt Nagy, understanding that as well, once they understood that Hill was out, Kelce would, in fact, become their main guy. And they wouldn't shy away from it whatsoever. He would be a decoy at times, but you just saw a number of plays where you have them settling for hitch route after hitch route after hitch route after curl route to Travis Kelce on repeat. Not to mention these short RPO plays, these quick wide receiver screen plays, and some of the most predictable interior rushing plays you'll ever see in your life. That was Matt Nagy's offense. And it was atrocious on a year-to-year basis. Rarely did it encourage anything when it came to being able to make something out of nothing. That improv is what made Mahomes' magic real, especially in his first few years as a starter for this team. And you mentioned this stat here. 41% of his passes were completed when under duress this season, being the lowest percentage in his career to this point. But he's always been able to make something out of nothing. He's always been able to extend the play and find the open man down the field. That's always been a part of his game. And it became a liability for him this season. Yes, some of that is, again, how defenses since that time have been playing around the league, generally speaking. We didn't just start getting to a point where you had teams unrelentingly playing too high safeties out of nowhere. Tyreek Hill was that lethal over the top. And every single time you left him on an island, it was over. So the Chiefs overall have some influence in that. And you could argue that a step for them was always going to be taken back in that situation. with just how well run they had been doing that thing for that much time. But there ain't no excuse to fall all the way down into one of the worst offenses in the league. And so Nagy, I don't even give a damn. They mention, in this article, I think from NBC, he wasn't expected to stay with the team after being on an expiring contract, as NBC Sports would essentially state Pro Football Talk. So he might not have been coming back anyways, and even if he was, man, you fire his ass. Because the just damage, the irreversible damn near, it felt like for a while, damage that he's done to this core is just, it can't be allowed anymore. Pacheco lit it up. And even with Kareem Hunt, being a reliable secondary option at times, he's seen much better days as a running back. The fact that both of them combined for just a single run of 20 or more yards across the entire season with one of the worst rushing offenses in the NFL. It's atrocious. It made the Chiefs one-dimensional. And that one dimension wasn't even as strong as it had used to be. Chiefs were at their best when they were definitely approaching things from an air raid perspective. But god damn it, when they had to run the football, especially in that 2022 season, with Pacheco, coming out of there and making things happen on that end, even since that point, they have the ability to make these plays in space. They have the ability at that time to alleviate the burden a little bit. Lean on that rushing attack and lean on a decent defense to get the job done at times. That's what the Chiefs could do once upon a time. And now you don't even get that. Your greatest asset is your weakness, potentially, as a team. And your rushing attack isn't even competent enough to bail you out. And you get the results that you got this season. We're going pass after pass after pass relentlessly. And with, all of these incompletions under duress, drives are ending quicker. They're not possessing the ball for long enough. And ultimately, in games where they consistently were within one score, that is the exact reason you could chalk this up to them having a losing record in those situations. Far lower ball control than they would have wanted in that situation. But Bienemy, again, over the past few years, he's been all over the place. From UCLA to, from the Commanders to UCLA, and then to the Bears most recently, where again, Munningai and Swift are another pair of running backs who are on the smaller side themselves. And they are the only team in the NFL this season, if I'm not mistaken, or at least one of two along with the Lions, to finish with multiple rushers having over 700 yards on the ground. That's how great they were. You got a similar thing. DeAndre Swift, former high-end draft pick for the Lions, and Kyle Munningai being damn near a UDFA at this point. Although he was drafted in the late round as well. Also from Rutgers, coincidentally, Isaiah Pacheco, also from Rutgers. And he was able to do wonders with those guys in the backfield this season. So I have no doubt that with him back in the building, man, this offense is about to regain their footing in a season where this has just, again, been miserable for them. In how do I put it? A potential end to the dynasty as many people would entertain. Not look pretty at all. So you're at this point where you are incredibly desperate for a spark, for a turnaround. Because something's got to give at some point. And they may have gotten it. They may have. The Titans would hire Robert Saleh as a head coach in hopes that they can replicate what they did with Mike Vrabel. Obviously, him being a former defensive coordinator at that time and being hired, getting this Tennessee Titans team to, reach a fair amount of playoff success in the time that he'd been there before moving on to New England. Robert Saleh, has been a guy who has been a solid defensive coordinator for all this time. So as they've mentioned across, the regular season, he was probably always going to be up for another head coaching job soon. And clearly, again, in his time in New York, things did not go well at all. And I mean at all, right? They just, we don't even have to get into it from that perspective. It was not good. It just wasn't. However, when looking at him, it's kind of tough to hold that Jets tenure against him. I mean, we still understand that at this point, the Jets are still a dysfunctional organization. Very much so. And rarely do you see a situation where a coach can't even win with Aaron Rodgers. One, because he got hurt. And two, even when he was out there, offense was just anemic at that point. I'm not expecting him to have the greatest control of their offense in this situation. But the Titans' defense did finish off the season strongly overall. And they have a ton of pieces that he would want to look into specifically. You look at L'Jarius Sneed, you look at Jeffrey Simmons, it's not like they're a lost cause on that side of the football. It also gives a chance to have a veteran voice in there, if I do say so, from that perspective. To have influence over an offense that is fairly young, I will say. The team itself, obviously, they're going to be in a deep rebuild. But, man, as long as you have somebody competent back there, and it'd be interesting to see who their offensive coordinator hire would be to pair up with Robert Saleh, to have even more of a direct influence on what Cam Ward does. But, man, with the way that he finished his season, you get the right voice in there, and you may have yourself a turnaround next season from his standpoint individually. One thing you could note about Robert Saleh is that the defense as well for the 49ers, clearly, the defense was hampered. They did not end off the year on a dominant note. In fact, far from it. They were the ones that got dominated. So, to have that be your lasting image in San Francisco could be a problem when looking at it from Tennessee's perspective. But I think, again, given, a lot of the other head coaches on the docket at this particular point of time, you're just trying to find one that you believe fits the timeline for your team and that can allow you to reach a much greater level of overall success. That doesn't mean that Robert Saleh has necessarily proven that as a head coach he can do exactly that. Like, he has yet at this point to finish with an above 500 record, I should say, as a head coach. So I'm not looking at it from that perspective. But I'm saying they are willing at the very least to try something. The only way to go from rock bottom, and I mean that wholeheartedly, because they are it, right? But the only way to go from there is up. So you have to, in this situation, every, hire is going to look different for different teams. And I mean, the Titans have been through some coaching chaos themselves over the past few seasons. They had no other choice but to get Brian Callahan out of there. And even then, it's not like the interim coaches were any better. So you understood coming into this that you needed someone who you thought was going to be at the very least competent enough to do their damn job. And they must have enough faith in Robert Saleh to have him take everything over there. Fair enough. I can't blame them for that whatsoever. You could literally put Brian Callahan's ass in football terrorist territory. That's how bad he was. He had no business at all. Regardless of how much you want to question Robert Saleh, and even though that may be saying a lot, it's it can't get much worse. It can't get any worse than what Callahan was doing with this team. Right? You better fucking hope so. Because if that does somehow happen, that's going to be a tremendous problem. Yeah. The Packers, with another move here, would just do something pretty ironic. All it took was for him to play a few snaps across just 2 games. One in the regular season to finish it out against the Vikings, and obviously the wild card game against the Packers. Did not play much, played very sparingly. But in all of that, that was enough for the Packers to say, okay, we are going to, per multiple sources, release Trevon Diggs. Wow. Now, on the one hand, you kind of understand it, honestly. If the goal was for him to be a playoff rental and not a long-term solution at corner, well then, the plan was never, at that point, to retain his services. If it was always going to be just a brief, and very brief, I might add, addition for the playoffs, obviously you met that untimely exit, and at that point, you didn't have any more interest in keeping him on the team. Wasn't worth much value to you at that point. Fair enough from that standpoint. But you just got man, if you're Trevon Diggs, you're in the defensive scheme that you wanted to be. And I guess with Hafley being gone, depending on who they elevate or who they pick up as DC, maybe the same thing could apply. But I guess seeing how things went with the Cowboys, if they were trying to retain Trevon Diggs' services, maybe they just did not want to deal with all that extra noise in that situation. And from that standpoint, if that was the case, it's damn, you still can't find a way to work something out? That's interesting. But, okay. As this article would state here, essentially, Jordan Addison was cleared of pretty much anything in relation to what I had detailed in a recap previously, where he was arrested for trespass, essentially, misdemeanor trespass. So, as this quote states right here, A trespassing charge against Minnesota Vikings receiver Jordan Addison has been dismissed a little more than a week after the former USC star was arrested for allegedly refusing to leave a Tampa, Florida restaurant after being asked multiple times to do so. Susan S. Lopez, the state attorney for the 13th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida, filed a notice of termination of prosecution Tuesday in Hillsborough County Court, indicating that the case against Addison has been closed after a review of the criminal report affidavit. End quote. So, that was just going to be a brief follow-up there. Like, there isn't really much to add from that standpoint. You just thank goodness that this was nothing at all. And he can actually continue to operate with what it is that he might be doing. Because if he would have gotten himself wrapped up in something like that, it's like, again, everything that I had said in that particular video would have been even more relevant at that point. Because you just can't, again, gotta find a way in those scenarios to not even bother engaging in anything. But he did not end up getting charged with misdemeanor trespassing. The case is fully dismissed, and this is just a week after that initial arrest. So, there's not much else to add there. But at least he is good, and at least other people that might have potentially been involved in something like that are okay. Don't know if they're content with the decision to necessarily have all his charges dropped. But, I mean, man, it just would have been interesting from my perspective, I would think, to actually see this, I guess, body camera footage, potential CCTV footage, and, you know, from that standpoint, I'm probably not going to have access to any of that. But that would probably provide a little more context here. And I'm sure that something like that, along with other pieces of evidence, are things that were reviewed beforehand. Maybe with that being taken into account, this state attorney decided that either there was nothing truly there for Addison to be charged with this stuff, and we can just move on from having this conversation entirely, or, okay, maybe there's a chance that this happened, but we don't have enough evidence to really take this any further. So we have to end the case. It could be those two things or a number of other different things. I am not going to try to act like a legal person, but that's what I would believe is going on from this standpoint. And the Chargers would be pursuing Mike McDaniel. They're expected to hire him, essentially. As this Schefter and Darlington post mentioned, as well with some context, he limited his choices down to the Chargers. He informed other teams, Mike McDaniel himself, that he had interest in this particular job and this particular job only. They just now need to go through finalizing details and everything like that. That's the crux of this situation. It's pretty damn interesting, too. Like, from that standpoint, I do like the move. Because what you can understand from that perspective is that you are definitely getting explosive plays. You're definitely getting the creativity from Mike McDaniel, specifically. And you didn't have either one of those things with Greg Roman in that system. Now, of course, you don't want McDaniel to be in a spot where feeding, Amari and Hampton out of the backfield consistently is going to become the norm. But I can tell you one thing for damn sure. Because the scheme, again, for different quarterbacks is probably going to look different. And he understood at that point that Tua Tagovailoa was going to have to be more of a guy focused on timing. However, it just adds more to the plate of the hypothetical man. Because what I can say, to stamp it right now, is that this is going to be the best offensive coordinator that Justin Herbert has had. And if McDaniel game plans everything well enough, you have a chance to truly see Justin Herbert unlocked. There is absolutely no reason with what Mike McDaniel has been able to do with other offenses in the past, namely with him doing that work with San Francisco before getting the job with the Dolphins in the first place. There's no way with seeing that go down and seeing how he was able to make Tua Tagovailoa look like one of the best quarterbacks in the league, even if it was for a single season, and get him paid. If he can do that for him, you can only imagine just how much more he could do for Justin Herbert, given all of his intangibles and his clear-cut skill set on the field. His throwing ability, strong arm down the field, his ability to extend the play and actually run the football at a consistent level compared to what Tua Tagovailoa was doing on his front. You have so much to work with from that regard. And I'm sure that Mike McDaniel is going to have the answer when it comes to being able to put Justin Herbert in the best possible chance to succeed on that side of the football. So if there is still something going on with him when it comes to making these stupid mistakes at these times, or when it comes to him potentially underperforming, if either of those kinds of things continue to happen for Justin Herbert, as if we aren't already looking at him after not having a playoff win for all this time in his NFL career just yet, if he isn't already catching slack for that right now and having the hypothetical man stuff start to wear down, you best believe that is going to be ramped up if Mike McDaniel, of all offensive coordinators, cannot have Justin Herbert perform at a level rivaling those of the best quarterbacks in the league. And granted, Justin Herbert, even with weaker offensive coordinating talent, he's had those seasons. He's had those games to where you look at and you think that he is truly one of the top 10 quarterbacks in the NFL at varying points of time. And then you're hit with those kinds of performances like the one he had in the wild card game against the Patriots. Now, again, a lot of that is, Greg Roman as well, just kind of restricting that, one could say. But it's also poor execution on Justin Herbert's end. And my thing is that you no longer have that excuse to work with. We've already ran out of excuses, far past any of them. But okay, you have a tremendous offensive coordinator here. You cannot find a way to waste that, and you cannot fuck this up from that front. If you do, we gotta like truly look at Justin Herbert in a different lens from that perspective. If he still does not perform that well, despite having Mike McDaniel as an offensive coordinating talent, it's insane to think about. Not to mention how he's going to be able to work with all these different types of wide receivers. The Chargers truly have a solid core. And, I don't know how much longer Keenan Allen would have in the NFL, but between being able to make the most out of him as a safety valve, what he could do with Rondé Gadsden II as a young tight end, and not to mention being able to have Lab McConkey play all over the field, along with Quentin Johnston maybe starting to come into his own. Like, there is so much on the offensive side of the ball to work with. And just you wait, too, when this offensive line comes back. For all those guys who still want to hang their hats on that and continue to try to defend this Justin Herbert shit by bringing up those points, which are fair, because, again, losing Slater in one fell swoop, automatically tough. Both of those guys are elite at their position. Truly some of the best in the NFL. So when you get your full offensive line back, that could change up things a little bit, for damn sure. This offense could be something scary if this operates well. But it's going to be on the execution at that point. Like, I have no doubt in Mike McDaniel's ability to get this done. Truly. The weapons are there for him to work with. They got to perform. And if they don't, there's going to be a problem. And for our last move, the Bucs would also hire Zac Robinson away from the Falcons as an offensive coordinator themselves. Again, it's still been rough for them to try to replace Liam Cohen. But Zac Robinson, to poach him away from a division rival, understanding that you played off against them twice this season, and they've had that kind of success against you offensively, it's just kind of ironic. It's like, if you can't beat them, we're going to make them join you. At that point, fuck it. Why not? But that'll do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.